The grey sky of London had settled over Trafalgar Square in the early hours of the morning. Fog curled around the historic columns and lion statues in the square, making them appear almost ghostly. The cold had frozen both the stones and the people alike. The drizzle, mixed with snow, clung to the wings of the pigeons that never left the square and splashed against the faces of those walking with hurried steps. People huddled closer in their coats to protect themselves from the cold, and no one raised their head to look around. At one corner of the square, next to an old bench, Harold sat. 30 years ago, it would have been impossible for anyone to imagine Harold sitting here. In those days, Harold was one of the city's most renowned portrait painters. He had received accolades from the Royal Academy of Arts, and London's upper class queued up to be immortalized on his canvas. Harold's hands were once like a miracle, transferring immortal beauty and the deepest emotions onto the canvas. But now, that miracle sat with a brush in his trembling, aged hands under the drizzling rain. Throughout his life, Harold's talent had never been questioned, but his fortune always had been. At the height of his success, he had lost his wife Clara in a car accident. This loss created the first crack in Harold's life. Then, health problems emerged, and treatments disrupted his focus on his art. Work declined, and the crowds around him grew sparse. Even worse, Harold's only son, Timothy, turned his back on him as he entered adulthood. Timothy did not share Harold's vision. For him, painting was a futile effort in an insufficient life. The cracks formed by these losses in Harold's inner world gradually turned into vast chasms. Today, Harold sat in Trafalgar Square, his trembling hands drawing the portrait of a child, his life steeped in loneliness. But one thing had never changed: his art. Art had become the only branch keeping Harold tethered to life. Every morning he would take his old palette and come to the corner of the square, trying to capture beauty even for a fleeting moment amidst the fast-paced steps of London. That day, however, Harold's mood was even heavier. He felt as though he was stuck in a dead-end life. He had begun working on the child's portrait, but the brushstrokes were forced. His trembling hands were under the influence of not just the cold, but a deep melancholy. When he began painting the child's eyes, he stopped and left the brush beside the canvas. He looked at his hands and muttered to himself, "Even my hands are betraying me now." He sat there for a while. The wind seeped through the holes in Harold's patched coat, sending a shiver through him. But he didn't get up, because sitting here was easier than admitting that he had nowhere else to go. For a moment he gazed at the unfinished child's portrait on the canvas. He had wanted to capture the light in the child's eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to make that final brushstroke. Inside, he felt an endless sense of incompleteness. Just then there was movement on the other side of the square. A group of people entered the square with flashes and hurried steps. Harold, accustomed to his quiet life, was not used to crowds. He turned his head and stood up to see the source of the commotion. In the middle of the crowd was a tall man wearing a black coat, Benedict Cumberbatch. Harold recognized him immediately. This actor, known throughout the country, represented a completely different universe from Harold's: luxury, fame, and grandeur. But at the same time, in Harold's eyes, it was an empty world. Benedict, focused on his phone, walked briskly. His presence, rather than enlivening the square, seemed to freeze it even further. People swirled around him, but Benedict wasn't looking at anyone. Harold just watched. A feeling within him told him that somehow this man was about to step into his world. Benedict, focused on his phone, moved quickly with the crowd parting to make way for him. The intensity in his eyes and his sense of urgency pushed the world around him further away with every step. Harold, meanwhile, stood before his canvas, glancing at his portrait while also watching the silhouette of Benedict rapidly approaching. Suddenly, without realizing it, Benedict knocked into the palette with his paints. The paint spilled onto the ground, brushes scattered, and the colors mingled together. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The spilled paints felt like more than just a physical disaster. They seemed to reflect all the losses and fractures Harold had endured. The chaotic colors on the ground were the ruins of the past, a deep symbol of a life, of an artist's erased memories. Harold lifted his head, his lips trembling as he stared at Benedict's back, his anger building up inside him. That anger wasn't just about the spilled paints. It was the echo of years of accumulated frustration and loss. In his eyes, there was the pain and solitude of the years. "This isn't just a few paints," he said, taking a deep breath. "You didn't notice, but every brushstroke, every color, every shadow, they all have meaning. These paints are the traces of my past. In those colors, there's the loss of Clara. There's Timothy turning his back on me. For years I've fought with these colors, made them exist on the canvas. But you, with your phone in your hand, walk through this world like it's a game. Art isn't about rising fast or being bright, Benedict. Art carries a loss with every step, a memory with every stroke. We are lost people. Don't we have to leave something behind to be remembered? But you're all chasing the next rise. You're so lost, you've forgotten to even look around you. Have you ever thought about this, Benedict? Does a person's life create a painting where with every day, another step is lost? Or do you just want to rise?" Benedict froze for a moment. Harold's words had shaken him deeply in a way he hadn't expected. His arrogant attitude vanished instantly. He just silently looked at Harold, a void in him, unsure of what to say. In Harold's words, there was a sadness carried for years, traces of a life struggle. Art wasn't just a search. It was an expression of struggle, loss, and emotions. But Benedict had never seen it through that lens. It took him some time to grasp the meaning behind Harold's words, the emptiness inside him. "I guess I've never thought about that," he said, but he still hadn't fully understood the depth in Harold's eyes. Benedict, still trying to comprehend the depth in Harold's eyes, took a step back. The silence seemed to envelop both of them, almost as if they were intoxicated by it. The crowd, the people circling around them for a brief moment, forgot about them and continued with their lives. But Harold, knowing that everything is part of the past, could feel how time passed, even in that silence. Benedict's expression had changed. The arrogant mask was gone, replaced by a strange sense of disorientation and disappointment. For Benedict, an artist's life had been a fleeting joy, just about shining brightly at a dazzling speed and then vanishing. But Harold knew that every brushstroke carried a lifetime, a story, a loss. Harold remained silent for a while longer. He noticed the mixed paints on the ground. Among the colors, there was a time, a history, a trace that seemed lost. For a moment he thought about reaching for his palette, but then he simply sighed deeply and pulled his hand back. "Benedict," he said slowly, "art isn't just about seeing something. Sometimes it's about understanding rather than seeing. Young people like you see the flashy, fast parts of everything and pass them by. But without fully understanding a painting, without discovering the story lost within it, you can never be an artist. Art, no matter how much you shine, always leaves something behind that won't fade. A brushstroke, a memory. You have to accept your own loss, Benedict. Only then can you truly create something." Benedict took a deep breath before responding to Harold's words. No one had ever said anything like this to him. For the first time, he was hearing a voice that tried to understand the emotions outside of the world he lived in, a voice speaking to those left behind by loss. But he still didn't have the courage to take a step forward. "So, what you mean is that it's not about rushing forward and being on top, but about stopping and looking?" he asked, still a bit hesitant. "How can I do that, Harold? I'm running all the time. I don't even have a chance to slow down. No one wants to waste time." Harold took one more step towards Benedict, locking his gaze with his. "That's why you're losing. Without understanding that, you can't win anything." After another brief silence, Harold slowly examined the mix of paints on the ground, then said, "The meaning of life is hidden in loss. As long as you're not lost, you can't understand what's truly valuable. And an artist is shaped by their losses. They live with them. They pour their pain and joy onto the canvas." Benedict tried to clear the confusion in his mind a bit more. He still had trouble seeing himself through the eyes of an artist, but Harold's words had opened a different window for him. "So, maybe one day I could make a painting, something that tells what loss means," he said, a little shyly. Harold nodded with a slight smile. "There can be no deeper meaning than that," he said. "But first, you need to stop and look. Without slowing down, without seeing the losses inside you, it's impossible to understand this world. Sometimes you have to take a step back." Benedict remained silent for a few seconds. Then, with a deep sigh, he said, "I guess I should do that one day." But at that moment, he still couldn't fully grasp the meaning of all that had been said. Still, it seemed like the emptiness inside him had been filled, even if just a little. And Harold, looking at him with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, said, "You'll learn in time. Real art doesn't come in a rush, Benedict." Benedict, still affected by Harold's last words, nodded, realizing he had to rush off for the interview. The confusion of the moment had created a fog in his mind. As the crowd continued to whirl around them, Benedict took a step forward and slowly began to move away. However, somehow, his interest in Harold's presence and words made him pause and slow down a bit. He looked back at Harold. He saw him, focused on his canvas, continuing to work silently among the mixed paints. As he slowly mixed the colors, Benedict noticed how the hues, reflecting the traces of the past, began to take shape with deep expressions. Harold's work seemed like a part of his inner struggle. Each brushstroke told the story of his losses, broken heart, and resistance against life. Benedict, carrying those deep looks in his mind, slowly walked away. As Benedict walked toward the interview location, he was still thinking about the moment when Harold was focused on his canvas. There was no longer any reason to rush. In his mind, Harold's words were echoing. Art doesn't fade with time. With every stroke, there is pain, hope, loss, and sometimes even salvation. As Benedict watched Harold, he realized that being an artist wasn't just about the shining moments. Every lost thing, every moment of loss, could truly turn into a work of art. In that moment, the admiration and a kind of respect he felt for Harold had softened something inside him. For a moment, Benedict, who had been rushing through his own world, had now slowed down. He looked back and took a deep breath. He had realized something. No matter how high he climbed, rushing forward wouldn't get him anywhere, and sometimes a moment of slowing down was incredibly important. But these thoughts filled him with a sense of emptiness as time passed quickly. Still, while observing Harold from a distance, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe one day he too could reflect his own losses and deep emotions on his canvas. Benedict quickened his pace and continued toward his interview, but the feeling of change inside him was as deep as Harold's canvas, and he knew that one day it too would have to find meaning. That night after the interview, Benedict spent the evening alone in his room. For the first time, beyond work and public image, he felt something deep within. Harold's words echoed in his mind. In his fast-moving life, he had recognized the need to stop for a moment, slow down, and see the deep traces of the past and loss. However, without fully understanding, he allowed these thoughts to slip away. Still in his mind, he carried Harold's portrait, the falling paints, and the meaning behind each brushstroke. Throughout the night, though he couldn't fully name his complex feelings, he felt something inside him beginning to change. While his outer world remained fast and bright, the emptiness inside him was somehow gaining meaning. In that moment, he began to think not only about how time passed, but also about how the time he spent was shaping him. The next morning, Benedict woke up and remained silent in his room for a while. He hadn't fully figured out the meaning of the previous day, but something had changed. During a walk through the city, he somehow found himself on the street where the gallery was located again. He had seen Harold once more, working silently and deeply focused on his canvas. At that moment, Benedict made a decision. He took out his phone and captured a photo of Harold's portrait. He caught all the details of the work, the special moment when the colors mixed, and Harold's gaze. diving into depth. Then he shared the photo on his social media account. Many of his followers immediately showed interest in the post. But Benedict didn't want to share this photo just as an artist. He wanted to share it as a human being. As the days passed, Benedict realized the impact of the message he had written under the photo. He had not only talked about Harold's art, but also how much one could reflect a person's inner struggles and losses. Sometimes, before we lose the real meaning of life, we have to face our losses, he had written. Art is not just an outward expression, it's an inner discovery, a battle. Taking Harold's portrait, even something so simple sheds light on the depths within us. It reminds us that, in this fast-paced world, we need to stop and look inward for a moment. Benedict's post had suddenly created a huge impact. Hundreds of people were moved by the message he wrote and the portrait he shared. However, what truly mattered to Benedict was the power he felt in such a simple act, the power to create a beginning that could change someone's life. Slowly, but with certain steps, he was undergoing an inner transformation. A week later, Benedict sent Harold a message. He wrote about the impact of the photo he had seen on social media and his deep respect for Harold. "Your art made me realize that life holds much deeper meaning," he wrote. "That's why I have an offer for you. I would like to work with you on a project. Art like yours can truly change the world." Harold read the message in astonishment. No one had offered him something meaningful or valued him in such a long time. This was a big change for him. Over time, Harold agreed to join the project, and they started working together. Benedict aimed to bring Harold's art to a wider audience and reveal its true value. Eventually, Harold's art became recognized by many more people. However, the real change in his life had started with the small but meaningful opportunity Benedict had given him. Benedict's support, not just as an artist, but as a human being, helped Harold regain the confidence he had lost long ago. This collaboration became something much more than just an art project. For both men, it was a path to finding meaning beyond past losses and pain, a way to support each other. Benedict's small gesture of help to Harold was perhaps the thing that most warmed his heart and deeply changed him. Driven by the desire to make a meaningful impact on Harold's life, Benedict decided to plan something. He wanted to introduce his art to a wider audience and help others feel the deep meaning his art held. But for that, he first needed to create an opportunity for Harold to show how much an artist could impact the outside world. He took the first step and immediately began taking action. For a month, he began sending people from different walks of life around the city to have their portraits drawn by Harold, introducing them to his unique style and explaining its meaning. Sometimes he would choose an old friend, sometimes a stranger, or sometimes just an ordinary person from the crowd, guiding them to sit in front of Harold's canvas. Each person had a different story, a different perspective. At first, Harold was reluctant to draw portraits of strangers, but little by little, he began to open up, and with each face, each new story, he started to find new meanings. Benedict realized that all these portraits coming together would form a whole and acquire meaning. So, he decided to create a collection from the portraits he had sent, eventually planning to open a large gallery. The gallery needed to reflect the deepest, most personal, and most meaningful traces of Harold's art. When choosing a name for it, Benedict thought of something that carried deep significance. After much thought, he decided to name it The Silence of Colors. It wasn't just about the colors blending together in Harold's art, but also about how his art reflected his past, his losses, and the balance he had found in life. The fading of colors, deepening over time, and then being reborn somehow symbolized life itself. When Benedict finally completed the project he had been working on for a month, one day he approached Harold and made an offer. "Harold, I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Like I told you a few weeks ago, there's something I want to show you. You need to see it to truly understand." Harold looked at him in surprise, but something in his gaze told him that things were different now. There was a sense of determination and warmth in Benedict's eyes. "Where to?" he asked, his curiosity growing. Without saying a word, Benedict began preparing to take him to the gallery. The final touches for the gallery opening had been made. At that moment, Benedict's desire to surprise Harold once more, with the natural reactions and surprises that would accompany this visit, would turn into a turning point for both of them. When Benedict and Harold stepped through the gallery door, Harold suddenly stopped. On the wall in front of him was a collection that reflected every phase of his life, his losses, his struggles, and the entire chaos and silence of the colors. Each portrait was a piece of a life, and behind each one was the trace of Harold's emotional depth. Harold couldn't believe his eyes. Not just the portraits, but each one transported him to an entirely different world, another reality. This was not just a gallery, it was a symbol of Harold's losses, pains, and the hopes that had been lost over the years. Benedict, standing beside him, smiled and turned to him. "I did this for you, Harold. I wanted to show you the real power of your art. This is not just yours, it's a part of all of us. Colors may disappear, but they are always reborn." Harold stood silently, momentarily realizing everything. His eyes filled with tears, but this time, there was no pain, only deep gratitude and inner peace. After all this time, in this very moment, the losses and struggles in his life had gained meaning. His art had become something that not only touched him but others as well. In that moment, Harold had overcome his losses and been reborn through all the colors of life. Harold took a deep breath in front of the portraits. Each brushstroke was part of the inner journey he had made over the years. The colors in these portraits reflected not only the canvas but also his soul. Every loss, every pain, every wrong step had turned into a turning point, a lesson learned. Benedict's words had reminded him of something he had long felt. "Colors may disappear, but they always come back," he had said. This simple but profound sentence had been enough to light up the dark corners inside him. Harold closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Suddenly, the sounds of the crowd faded, and the noise in the environment diminished as only an inner silence remained. His eyes filled with tears, but this time there was no pain, only meaning, only acceptance. He turned to Benedict and smiled gently. "Sometimes the strength we find in our losses becomes our greatest art," he said. "And unfortunately, we must follow our losses before we can understand everything. But those losses make us deeper, stronger people." He took another step, looking at the portraits as he continued speaking. "Art is not just an expression, it's a map of an inner journey. Everything we lose reminds us of how valuable we are. Colors may disappear, but they always return. Sometimes we may lose our way in the dark, but every loss leaves room for rebirth." Benedict met Harold's eyes, seeing the gratitude reflected in them. "These words, they are truly deep. We have all been shaped by our losses," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Harold nodded slightly, tears flowing from his eyes. But this time, his intent was not to cry. A smile slowly appeared on his face. Sometimes life brings us hard times, losses, and pain. But all of these are teachers. Our strength doesn't come from what we've lost, but from how we face it. Sometimes it gets dark, but we can still exist without the light. Everyone in the gallery listened silently to Harold's words. Eyes were filled with tears, and everyone was enveloped in a deep inner awareness. What he said resonated with everyone's heart like a bridge from heart to heart. It was not heard with the mind, but felt deeply with the heart. How a person could emerge from the darkest moments of life with strength. "We must find our inner strength," Harold said, his voice carrying a peaceful tone. "Sometimes we all get lost, but one day, when we realize we've been lost, we'll also realize we've been found." And at that moment, a sparkle of hope appeared in everyone's eyes in the gallery. Everyone thought once more about what their losses and pains had taught them. Harold's final words echoed deeply, touching everyone's heart. "Remember, colors may disappear, but they always return. Even when we are lost, we can be reborn. All the colors are within us, and they always come back." At that moment, the entire gallery became completely silent. Only the echo of inner peace and rebirth remained.